We gave you every opportunity and you threw it away. My mother sobbed. The sound was thin and practiced, cutting through the heavy, pressurized silence of the courtroom. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had likely been ironed that morning for the specific performance. Beside her, my father nodded. A single sharp movement of his chin that carried the weight of a final verdict. He did not look at me. He never looked at the things he had already decided were broken. My brother Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his back a rigid line of tailored wool, staring straight ahead at the mahogany bench, as if he were already counting the $2 million he claimed I owed him. My lawyer, Sarah, stayed calm. Her hands flat against the table, her breathing so steady it felt like a clock ticking down the seconds. Then Judge Harrison stopped reading. The rustle of paper ceased. Replaced by a silence so absolute I could hear the hum of the overhead lights and the distant screech of a siren out on the Boston streets. He looked up slowly, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. He said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the high ceilings. I read about this company in Forbes last week. He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping over my family like a searchlight. Someone here is lying to my face. The betrayal was supposed to be loud. I had always imagined it would involve screaming matches and slamming doors. The kind of cinematic chaos that leaves a house shaking. Instead, it was quiet enough to steal my breath. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving us all in a vacuum where the only thing that mattered was the lie they had spent months weaving. As I watched my mother's shoulders shake with those rhythmic, perfect sobs, my mind drifted back to a Tuesday night 20 years ago. The setting was different, but the temperature was the same. We were sitting in the dining room of our estate, the smell of roasted lamb and rosemary thick in the air. I was 10 years old. And I had spent the afternoon sketching a diagram of how the local power grid could be optimized to prevent surges. I had used a cloth napkin, my pencil scratching gray lines across the white linen. I remember the way the silver clinked against the china as I tried to explain the logic to my father. I was vibrating with the excitement of it, the way the systems connected, the way vulnerabilities could be patched before they were ever exploited. My father had watched me for a long minute, his fork poised halfway to his mouth. Then he smiled. It was the smile you give a child who is pretending to run a business with play money. That is a phase, Raven, he had said, his voice draped in a condescending kindness that stung worse than a slap. You will grow out of it. Focus on your piano lessons. That is where your value lies. My mother had laughed lightly, a melodic sound that effectively erased my napkin sketches from the conversation. Pass the mint jelly. Dear, she had said, and just like that, the system I had built was treated as a messy spill to be cleaned up. Those moments did not just happen once. They piled up like snow during a New England winter, quiet and cold, until the weight was enough to collapse a roof. There were holidays where Marcus was toasted for business deals he had not even closed yet. And there were dinners where the conversation simply stopped the moment I walked into the room. I was the other one. I was the ghost in a house of mirrors. The one who did not fit the polished, predictable legacy my father demanded. Now, standing in this courtroom, I realized the phase they thought I would grow out of had become the very thing they were trying to steal. They had ignored my work when it was small, mocked it when it was a struggle, and now that it was a triumph, they had decided it belonged to them. I looked at Sarah. She did not turn to me. But I saw the slight tightening of her jaw. She knew what was in the folders stacked neatly in front of her. She knew the truth of the audited records, the signatures that did not match my own, and the years of silence I had used as a shield. The judge was still staring at Marcus, whose smug expression was beginning to fray at the edges, a thread pulling loose from a sweater. The transition from being the victim to being the accused was happening in real time, and for the first time in my life, I was not bracing for the impact. I was the impact. The chill of the courtroom faded into the background as my mind pulled me back 3 years, to the cramped apartment that served as the birthplace of Nexus Tech. The space was less of a home and more of a laboratory for a life I was building in total secrecy. My entire world was condensed into a 1,200 square foot flat in a neighborhood my father wouldn't have even driven through. The furniture consisted of a single folding table that sagged under the weight of 2 high-powered monitors and a laptop that hummed like a living thing. I remember the smell of stale coffee and the blue light of the screens reflecting against the windows at 4 in the morning. Success, at that stage, was not measured in millions of dollars or national headlines. It was measured in lines of code that finally executed without error and the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem no one else knew existed. I was obsessed with the architecture of digital security, building systems that could think 3 steps ahead of a threat. It was the same way I had learned to navigate my family. I spent my days anticipating their disapproval and patching the vulnerabilities in my own spirit before they could find them. When I married James, it was the first time I felt truly safe. We did not have a grand gala or a 5-tier cake. We went to the city hall on a rainy Tuesday. I took his last name with a sense of relief that felt like shedding a heavy skin. By taking on my husband James's last name, Miller, I had effectively ghosted the social registries that my mother monitored like a hawk. To the world of the Boston elite, Raven Whitmore had simply faded away into a quiet, unremarkable marriage. I remember one specific evening when Marcus called me. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by printed schematics, my fingers stained with ink. I let the phone ring 4 times before answering. "Raven," he had said, his voice dripping with that familiar, polished pity. "I am just checking in. Mom mentioned you missed the charity auction last night. I told her you were probably just busy with your little consulting hobby." "I am fine, Marcus," I replied, my voice as neutral as a dial tone. "Just working." "Right. Working?" He chuckled, and I could practically hear the smirk through the line. "Listen. If things get too tight, just say the word. Dad is still disappointed you walked away from the firm, but he is a sucker for a rescue mission. Do not let your pride make you go hungry." I looked at the monitor where a contract for $40,000 was waiting for my digital signature. It was more money than I had made in the previous 6 months combined. "I am not hungry, Marcus. But thanks for the concern. Suit yourself," he said. "Just remember, the real world is a lot harder than those little logic puzzles you like to play with." I hung up and felt a surge of energy that was better than any caffeine. I did not want to correct him. I did not want to tell him that while he was busy networking at auctions, I was quietly securing the infrastructure for 3 of the largest logistics firms in the Northeast. I let him believe I was struggling. I let my mother send me $50 gift cards for groceries on my birthday, which I tucked into a drawer and never used. Silence was my armor. Every time they underestimated me, it bought me another month of peace to grow my company without their interference. I learned to survive on focus and a stubborn, quiet pride. I learned how to keep going without the applause I knew was never coming from them anyway. James would watch me from the doorway, holding a mug of tea, his eyes full of a quiet understanding that my father could never grasp. "You do not have to hide from them forever," James had said one night as I hovered over a server migration. "I am not hiding," I told him, my eyes fixed on the scrolling green text. "I am fortifying. There is a difference." I did not realize then that while I was building my walls, Marcus was beginning to notice the cracks in his own. He was the golden hair, the one who had stepped into my father's world without question. But the world of finance was changing, and Marcus was a man built for the past. He saw my silence not as a boundary, but as a void that he could eventually fill with his own needs. The success of Nexus Tech did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived in small, steady confirmations that I kept locked away. A contract renewed without negotiation. A client who stopped asking if I could do the work and started asking how soon I could start. New faces joined my team. People who moved into a real office space I rented under a holding company name. For 2 years, the plan worked perfectly. I was a ghost to my family and a titan in my industry. But as the company grew, the shadow it cast became impossible to ignore. I started seeing my company name in trade journals. I saw my innovations being discussed on panels I refused to attend. I thought I had built a fortress. But I had actually built a lighthouse, and the light was finally beginning to reach the dark corners of my father's boardroom. The shift in the family dynamic was subtle at first. The condescension in their voices started to be replaced by a sharp, probing curiosity. The messages in the family group chat changed from pitying check to vague questions about my industry. "Heard tech is volatile right now," Marcus had messaged. "Must be stressful. Not having the stability of a legacy firm behind you." I didn't answer. I stood in my office, looking out at the Boston skyline, and felt the first cold breeze of the coming storm. I had spent my whole life trying to be invisible to them, but I was about to find out that, to people like my brother, my success was the ultimate betrayal. By the time they noticed I had built something real, they weren't impressed. They were hungry. And Marcus had always been the hungriest of them all. The shift from curiosity to entitlement happened over a single Sunday brunch at my parents' estate. The air in the dining room smelled of expensive lilies and the salt air blowing in from the harbor. I sat across from Marcus, who was nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching me with an intensity that made the back of my neck prickle. My mother was busy rearranging a platter of smoked salmon, her movements precise and jittery. "So, Raven," Marcus began, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I saw a mention of a company called Nexus in the quarterly tech report. The founder's name was redacted, but the methodology for their encryption sounded remarkably like those little napkin sketches you used to bore us with at dinner. Tell me, is that you? Or did someone finally just steal your ideas?" He said it like a joke, but his eyes did not laugh. They searched my face, waiting for a flinch, waiting to measure the exact volume of the space I was taking up in the world. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the heat settle in my chest. "I do a bit of consulting, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice as flat as a desert floor. "It is a crowded market. I am sure plenty of people are using similar logic." "Consulting?" My mother chimed in, her voice pitched too high. "That is so, wonderful dear. But you know, Arthur was saying just this morning that if you ever wanted to come back to the family firm, there are opportunities. Real opportunities. Not just these little freelance projects." The word opportunities sat heavy and wrong in my stomach. It was not an invitation to join them. It was an assessment of my value. They were trying to pull me back into the orbit of their control, sensing that I had drifted too far into a galaxy they did not own. My father watched me from the head of the table, his silence more demanding than any question. "I am happy where I am," I said. The rest of the meal was a minefield of passive, aggressive concern. Marcus kept digging, mentioning specific venture capital rounds and asking if I knew the players involved. Every question was a probe, a needle seeking a soft spot. I felt the paranoia beginning to take root. They were not proud, they were threatened. A daughter who succeeded in silence was a daughter who did not owe them anything. And in my father's house, debt was the only thing that kept you family. When I returned to my office on Monday morning, The paranoia shifted into a cold reality. My lead developer, a man named Leo who had been with me since the folding table days, met me at the door. He looked pale, his tablet clutched against his chest. "Raven, we had a security breach on the back end of our public filing system," Leo said, his voice low. "Someone wasn't trying to steal our source code. They were looking for the cap table. They were looking for the names of the shareholders." "Did they get in?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Leo replied, "The firewall held, but the IP address was traced back to a private server in the financial district. It was a targeted, professional ping." I sat at my desk and stared at the city skyline. The financial district was where my father's firm was located. The realization felt like a physical weight. They weren't just curious anymore. They were hunting. They wanted to see if I was a target or a peer, and in their minds, there was no difference. That night, I told James that the walls of the fortress were being tested. He didn't argue. He had seen the way Marcus looked at me at brunch. Like a man looking at a piece of property he had accidentally sold for too low a price. "They are going to try to claim a piece of it, Raven," James warned me. "People like your brother do not let things grow in the dark, unless they plan on harvesting them." I stayed up until 3 in the morning, checking and checking my encryption protocols. I felt like I was back in that childhood house, hiding my sketches under my mattress. The only difference was that now, my sketches were worth millions, and the people trying to find them weren't just dismissive. They were dangerous. I had spent my life trying to be invisible to keep them away, but my success had become a beacon I could no longer turn off. The storm I had been bracing for was finally making landfall. The envelope was waiting for me on the console table in the hallway, looking entirely too clean against the dark wood. It was thick, heavy, and official, with my legal name printed in a font that looked like a shout. I stood there for a long time, my keys still biting into my palm, just staring at it. I had spent years building a life of quiet precision, and this white rectangle felt like a jagged rock thrown through a window. When I finally pulled the document out, the words did not register as a narrative. They hit me as a series of sharp, disconnected data points. Involuntary bankruptcy petition. Creditor Marcus Whitmore. Principal amount $1,850,000. I read the numbers 3 times, waiting for the surge of adrenaline or the hot flare of panic. But what came instead was a cold, crystalline stillness. It was the same feeling I got when a server crashed in the middle of the night. A sudden transition from life to logic. Marcus had not just filed a claim, he had crafted an entire history. The petition alleged that I had accepted multiple private loans from him during the founding years of my company. It claimed I had defaulted on payments, ignored formal notices, and was currently insolvent. Every line was a confident, methodical lie wrapped in the cold authority of legal jargon. He was not just asking for money he knew I had, he was trying to use the court system to freeze my assets, to create enough chaos to scare off my clients and force me back into the family fold as a failure. I did not go to the kitchen to cry. I did not call my mother to ask why she had allowed this. I walked straight to my home office and dialed Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice as steady as an anchor. "It happened," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Marcus filed for an involuntary bankruptcy. He is claiming almost $2 million in personal loans that never existed." There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence a professional uses to reorient their map. "He is trying to force a process," Sarah said finally. "This is not about the money, Raven. He knows those loans are fake, but by filing this, he triggers a public record. He creates doubt about your company's stability, right when your national contracts are being finalized. He is counting on you reacting emotionally instead of strategically. How does he expect to win? I asked. I have the bank records. I have every statement from the last 5 years. He does not expect to win the case. Sarah replied. He expects to win the war of attrition. He thinks you will settle or collapse under the pressure of the scandal just to make it go away. He is banking on the fact that you still care about the family name. That was the moment the weight of it truly landed. This was not a moment of impulsive jealousy from Marcus. This took coordination. It took a team of lawyers and a nodding approval from my father. Someone had to decide that destroying my reputation was an acceptable price for bringing me back under their thumb. I thought of the Sunday brunches and the perfect smiles. They had been waiting for me to fail, and when I refused to do it on my own, they decided to do it for me. What do we do? I asked. We do not engage with them, Sarah said. We do not call them. We do not negotiate. We gather the truth and we hold it like a shield. Silence is no longer just your protection, Raven. It is our strategy. If they want to paint you as a reckless amateur, we will show up to that courtroom with the most precise, audited history they have ever seen. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark. The anger was there, lurking under the cold logic, but I refused to let it steer. This was an execution plan, a calculated move to erase the person I had become and replace her with the failure they preferred. I realized then that my family did not love me. They loved the version of me they could control. And as I looked at the thick stack of lies in my hand, I knew that the only way to survive was to let that version of me die once and for all. I began to pull my records, one clean, audited trail at a time. The battle was no longer about money. It was about who had the right to define my reality. The days following the arrival of the petition blurred into a rhythmic, grueling cycle of data and isolation. I existed in a state of hyper-vigilance, moving between my office and my home like a ghost in my own life. While Marcus and my father were likely celebrating their opening move with scotch and self-congratulation, I was working with Sarah to build a mountain of evidence, so steep it would crush any lie they tried to place upon it. Every bank statement from the last 5 years, every tax filing, and every line of my corporate audit was pulled, indexed, and cross-referenced. We were not just preparing a defense. We were documenting a life they refused to acknowledge. Despite the clinical nature of the work, the emotional isolation was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I watched from the digital periphery as my family closed ranks. On social media, my mother posted photos of a family dinner at their favorite steakhouse. The table was set for 4, but only 3 chairs were occupied. Marcus looked jubilant, leaning into the frame with a wide, victorious grin, while my father sat at the head of the table, like a king confirming a conquest. They were telling the world, and each other, a story where I was the erratic, ungrateful daughter who had finally forced their hand. I was being erased from the family narrative in real time, replaced by a convenient villain. In the middle of the week, a final peace offering arrived in the form of an email from my father. The subject line was simply my name. Raven. It began. The tone as dry as parchment. We have seen the filings. It is clear that you have allowed things to spiral out of control. Your mother is distraught, and Marcus is only doing what is necessary to protect the family interests from your insolvency. However, there is still a way to resolve this quietly. If you admit you are in over your head and agree to fold your assets into the family firm for restructuring, Marcus will drop the suit. We can make this go away. Just come home and let us handle the details. I read the words over and over, my thumb hovering above the trackpad. It was a classic Whitmore maneuver. They create the fire, then offer you the only bucket of water, provided you sign over your soul to get it. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if the $2 million debt was real. He simply assumed his daughter was a failure. and offered to buy my silence with my own independence. "Do not answer it," James said, leaning over my shoulder. He had been my anchor through the sleepless nights, his presence a steady reminder that I had built a home that didn't require me to be small. "I am not going to," I said. I felt a strange, cold click inside my chest. The last lingering thread of a need for his approval finally snapped. "I am not going back. Not for a bucket of water, and certainly not for him." I deleted the email and turned back to the spreadsheets. My lawyer had been right. Silence was no longer just a way to hide. It was the only way to win. If I engaged, I was giving them power. If I argued, I was validating their drama. But if I stayed silent and showed up with the truth, I was something they had never encountered before. I was a variable they couldn't account for. At night, when the house was quiet and the city hummed outside, the anger tried to surface. It was a dangerous, jagged thing that asked why I wasn't enough. Why did my success feel like a betrayal to them? Why did they prefer me broken? I forced those questions back into the dark. This was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about making sure their lives collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. The courtroom was where the truth would finally hold. And as I packed my briefcase for the morning, I realized I was no longer bracing for the impact of their lies. I was the one bringing the storm. The courtroom was colder than I expected. It was not a physical drop in temperature, but an emotional froth that seemed to emanate from the very marble of the walls. Every sound was magnified. The rhythmic click of my heels on the linoleum felt like a countdown. And the heavy thud of the oak doors closing behind me sounded like a final seal. I had arrived early. A habit born from years of needing to master my environment before it could master me. I sat at the defense table, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of morning light, waiting for the collision I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. Sarah sat beside me, her presence a silent, immovable anchor. She did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply opened her briefcase and began arranging our documents with a surgical precision. There were the audited bank statements, the tax filings, and the independent forensic reports. They were neat, white rectangles of truth stacked against a mountain of colorful lies. Then, the doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet further. My family did not enter together. They were a fractured unit even in their coordinated attack. My mother came first, dressed in a black suit that looked more appropriate for a funeral than a hearing. She walked with her head bowed, her hand clutching a handkerchief, as if she were already mourning the daughter she was about to bury. Marcus followed her, his stride confident and expansive. He was shaking hands with his high-priced attorney, his face lit with a smug, relaxed energy. He looked like a man who had already won. A man who believed that his last name and his gender were enough to override any ledger. My father came last. He walked with his characteristic military posture, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the judge's bench. He did not look at me, not even a glance. To him, I was no longer a person. I was a line item that needed to be corrected. No one acknowledged my presence. That silence was the most honest thing they had ever given me. It confirmed that this was not a misunderstanding or a tragic mistake. This was alignment. This was a deliberate choice to extinguish my light so that their shadows could feel taller. When the hearing began, the stakes felt almost physical. Tightening wire around my throat. Marcus's attorney stood and began to weave a tapestry of fiction. His voice was smooth, like expensive bourbon, as he described my company as a reckless, overextended operation. He spoke of loans given in good faith. I felt of a brother's desperate attempt to save a sister who was drowning in her own ambition. He talked about debts and obligations, as if they were holy writ. My mother's performance was flawless. On cue, she began to cry softly, the sound of her grief filling the gaps in the lawyer's testimony. When she was called to provide a brief statement on the family, her voice cracked with a practiced perfection. "We gave her every opportunity," she said, her eyes fixed on the judge. "And she threw it all away. We only want what is best for her, even if she cannot see it herself." I felt a surge of nausea. It was the same lie she had told at the dinner table 20 years ago, updated for a modern audience. She said it with such conviction that for a split second, I felt the old ghost of doubt clawing at my chest. I looked at my father, who nodded once, a small, controlled gesture of approval. That nod landed harder than any word. Marcus sat there, his hands folded, staring straight ahead. He wasn't even looking at the evidence. He was looking at his own version of reality. A world where he was the hero and I was the cautionary tale. He truly believed that this courtroom was the final proof. He had been right all along. The lowest point came when the judge, Harrison, began flipping through the petitioner's documents. He looked at the forged signatures, the fabricated ledger entries, and the desperate claims of insolvency. The room held its breath. I looked at the back of Marcus's head and realized that if the judge believed even 10% of this, my company would be tied up in litigation for years. My reputation would be stained, my contracts would vanish, and the fortress I had built with my own hands would crumble. I looked down at my own hands. They were not shaking. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, facing the combined weight of my past, I felt a strange shift. The ghost of my need for their love finally withered. I didn't want them to understand me anymore. I didn't want them to be proud. I wanted them to be finished. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Wait for the turn, Raven. Truth has a way of surviving pressure." The judge stopped turning pages. He removed his glasses and set them down on the bench with a sound that seemed to echo for an eternity. He leaned back and looked at the room, his gaze resting on me for a long, unreadable second. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was clear. The performance was over. The theater of my family's lies had reached its final act, and the judge was about to pull back the curtain. I stood on the edge of the cliff, no longer afraid of the fall, because I knew I was the only one in the room who knew how to fly. The silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy. It was sharp, like a blade held at the throat of a secret. Judge Harrison looked down at the documents provided by Marcus's legal team, then at the thick, blue-bound volume Sarah had submitted on my behalf. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as they moved from the papers to the gallery, where my mother had just finished her performance. "I have a question," the judge said, his voice steady and carrying with a resonant authority that made the air in the room feel thin. "About the company at the center of this petition, Nexus Tech." Marcus shifted in his seat, a small, confident smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He likely thought the judge was about to ask for a valuation so he could begin carving up the remains. "Of course, Your Honor," Marcus's lawyer said, standing quickly. "We are prepared to show that the defendant's mismanagement has led to a total lack of liquidity." "That is not what I am asking," Judge Harrison interrupted. He picked up a copy of a business publication from his desk and held it up. "I read about this company last week. Not in a legal filing, but in a national journal regarding the top 50 fastest growing technology firms in the country. The article described Nexus as a titan of infrastructure security, with significant cash reserves and a valuation exceeding $80 million. The crying from my mother stopped mid-breath. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's head snapped toward his lawyer, the color draining from his face so quickly it looked like he had been struck. "The petition I am holding," the judge continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble, "describes a failing, insolvent operation. but I am looking at audited financial records provided by the defense that show consistent, massive revenue growth. I am looking at bank statements that show no indication of insolvency whatsoever. In fact, I am looking at a company that has more liquidity in 1 quarter than the petitioner's own firm has seen in 3 years. Marcus shot to his feet, his composure finally shattering. Your Honor, that is ridiculous! She is twisting facts to protect herself. She is an amateur playing with numbers she does not understand. Sit down. Mr. Whitmore. Harrison snapped. The sound of his gavel hitting the bench was like a gunshot. I am also looking at something else. Signature analysis. Detailed, independent, and conclusive. He held up a page from our forensic report. These signatures on the alleged loan agreements do not match the defendant's handwriting. Not even close. In fact, they bear a striking resemblance to your own. I felt the weight of the last 20 years lift off my shoulders in a single, soaring moment of vindication. My father leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of the bench in front of him, his knuckles white. My mother's hand froze in her lap, her lace handkerchief forgotten. Sarah stood slowly, her voice calm and clinical. Your Honor, we are prepared to walk the court through every inconsistency. The payments referenced by the petitioner do not exist. The bills cited were never issued. Furthermore, interfering with an active, nationally recognized company through fraudulent filings is a matter of extreme gravity. We move for an immediate dismissal. The motion is granted. Judge Harrison said, his gaze fixed on Marcus with a look of pure, judicial disgust. I am dismissing this petition with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the evidence of forgery and fraudulent filing, I am referring this matter for criminal review. Someone in this courtroom has been lying to my face for the last hour, and it is not the defendant. The room erupted into a low, frantic mumble. Court officers approached Marcus and his attorney, their expressions grim. My brother looked smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He had come here to strip me of my life, but he had only succeeded in exposing the hollow center of his own. My mother reached for my arm as we stood to leave, her voice a desperate, panicked whisper. Raven? Wait. Alexis, please. We were only trying to help. We thought you were in trouble. I looked at her hand, then up at her face. I saw the fear there, but I also saw the calculation. The frantic search for a new lie that would bridge the gap back to my good graces. I looked at my father, who was staring at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. His mouth slightly open, the word, opportunity, finally dead on his lips. No, I said, my voice quiet but loud enough to cut through the chaos of the room. You were not trying to help. You were trying to be right. And you failed. I turned my back on them and walked toward the doors. The sound of the oak closing behind me was the last thing I heard from that life. I was no longer the ghost, and I was no longer the phase. I was the truth that had survived the pressure. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, cold light of a world that finally belonged to me. The fallout did not happen with a crash. It moved quietly, the way consequences usually move when there is no one left to shield them from the cold. As I walked down the granite steps of the courthouse, the air felt different, sharper, as if the world had finally come into focus after years of blurred edges. Behind me, the muffled sounds of the courtroom continued, but they belonged to a life that had officially ended the moment the judge struck his gavel. Marcus stopped calling first. Then, his lawyers stopped calling. Over the next few weeks, I did not hear the details directly, but I felt the tremors of his collapse through the industry grapevine, regulatory reviews, forensic audits of his own holdings, and quiet resignations. The language of certainty had abandoned him, replaced by the hushed, frantic tones of a man realizing that the legacy he had leaned on was made of glass. My parents tried a different approach. I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice soft and careful, explaining that no one had ever meant for things to go this far. She spoke as if the lawsuit had been a natural disaster, rather than a calculated execution. Then came the message from my father. It sounded less like an apology and more like a closing statement for a deal that had gone south. He talked about the importance of family reputation, about how mistakes should not define a person forever, and how we all needed to move forward for the sake of the name. I listened to it once, sitting in my kitchen with a glass of water, and then I deleted it. I did not do it out of spite. I did it out of clarity. What they had done was not a mistake born of love or concern. It was a choice born of a need for control. And choices do not dissolve just because the outcome makes you uncomfortable. Work moved forward with a newfound lightness. Meetings resumed. And my team showed up the way they always had, focused and steady. They did not ask for explanations, and I did not offer them. Their trust grounded me more than any courtroom verdict ever could. I was no longer a ghost in my own company. I stood at the head of the conference table. My last name no longer a secret I had to guard, but a fact that no longer had power over me. At home, life softened. The evenings were quieter, the constant, low-grade tension I had learned to live with finally releasing its grip on my shoulders. I slept better. I thought clearer. For the first time in a long while. My success did not feel like something I had to defend or hide. I realized that I had not won by watching them fall. I had won by standing still while the truth did what it always does when given enough room. It held. I learned something in that courtroom that I wish I had known when I was 10 years old, sketching on that napkin. Family is not defined by who shares your last name or who sits at your dinner table on holidays. It is defined by who stands beside you when the truth gets uncomfortable. Some people only love you when you are small enough to fit inside the role they have written for you. When you outgrow that role, they call it betrayal. But standing in the sun on my own terms, I knew better. It was not betrayal. It was finally becoming whole. I walked away from the wreckage of their expectations and toward a future I had built with my own two hands. And for the first time, I did not look back.